Good morning. Today's date is April 25th, 2007. My name is Thomas Murray. Today I'll be conducting an oral history interview with Philip W. Sheridan for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Phil.
Morning.
Could you give us your full name, spelling your last name, please?
Philip William Sheridan, S-H-E-R-I-D-A-N.
And Phil, where do you presently live?
Holyoke, Massachusetts.
And what was your date of birth?
March 18th, 1923.
And where was that?
That was Manchester, New Hampshire.
Did you grow up and go to school there?
Yes.
And what schools? Do you remember what schools you attended?
Oh, yes. They were both Catholic schools. Grammar school was McDonald's Grammar School, run by the Sisters of Mercy. And high school was St. Joseph's High School, run by the Christian Brothers. And I think there's both schools are still in existence as far as I know.
Mm-hmm. And you must mention that last school was quite a disciplinary school. The
Brothers didn't, it was a purely men's school, boys' school. And the Brothers didn't hesitate to belt you if you did something wrong. And the nuns used to lecture you, but the Brothers would give you a little discipline, belting.
Now, what was it like growing up at that time through the Depression area?
Perfectly comfortable. I don't remember any problems with growing up. My parents were disciplinary, and the Christian Brothers were, but we were allowed to grow fairly freely.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned you lived in a three-story or apartment building.
Three tenement building, 3 stories high. My father owned it, and we used the first floor as a family home, and he rented out the second and third floors. Mm-hmm. And they had, it was a typical arrangement as I understand it. There was a front stairwell that went up the 3 stories and a back stairwell that went up to 3 stories. Mm-hmm. A very comfortable living.
And you lived there until you went into the service, you mentioned?
Yeah. They had a bedroom off the kitchen.
So you don't remember any tough times as a child? I mean, it was kind of...
No. My father was part owner of a company, and I'm sure he brought home enough money so that everybody was comfortable.
Now, you mentioned when you got older you worked summers with your dad.
Particularly in high school, he took me at the beginning and put me in the shop dragging steel beams around or whatever, laborer. And as each summer progressed, he moved me into the office drafting room and helped in that respect, so that he became, started me down the road to engineering, I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you have any brothers and sisters?
No, I had no brothers, but I had 3 sisters, 2 that were older than me that are now deceased, and 1 younger than me that's still living up in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned your dad owned a company, or was part owner of a...
He was a part owner, third owner, as far as I know, of Lyons Iron Works. They were a steel fabricator.
Mm-hmm. And was your dad a veteran?
Yes, he went through World War I.
Do you remember anything about it that he did, or?
I'm almost positive he was a infantry private sergeant or something, served in Europe, and I'm almost positive the reason that he steered me into the Air Force and avoided draft and so forth was because of his service. He didn't want me to go down the same road. I can have that intuition in my thinking.
Now, did you graduate from high school?
Yes.
And where was that, Phil? What high school was that?
That was St. Joseph's
Okay, that was in Manchester.
in Manchester, New Hampshire, run by the Christian Brothers.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. What year was that? You remember?
Oh,
We had mentioned.
I think it was 1944.
Okay.
I'm not positive.
No, I think it was 41 you had mentioned before.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
sure. It had to be, 44 was the end of the war.
Right.
More, I graduated before the war had started, I believe, but
So, what did you do after school? Do you remember? Once you graduated from high school.
I worked at Lyons Iron Works under my father's guidance for a period of time while he steered me into the Army Air Corps as a cadet.
Now, you mentioned too you went to a year of college before then, though, didn't you?
That's correct. I went 1 year to Manhattan College,
Okay.
started my engineering education.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned you did a little work at the Grenier, Grenier field prior to entering
When I
service.
finished the freshman year at college, I guess both myself and my father were satisfied that the best thing to do was to get into the service, not go back to school for the second year. And that's what I did. My sister worked at Grenier Field in the general's office that was running the field, and she had good connections to steer me into the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And my father had connections, as I remember it. Not in the sense that he could really make me a cadet, but he knew who to talk to get me in there and mm-hmm. things of that nature. Yeah. As I remember it, we took exams and so forth before I went away to cadet school.
So at that time you were about 19 years old going into the service.
Well, if it was 40, probably 42 by then, and yes, 1923 to 1942 would be something of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember your dates of service?
The date I went in, not specifically, no.
Okay, we had, in looking through your records, we did find that basically you enlisted in November of 42, but you didn't actually go until 43. And
well, I remember a long period to enlist, so that I enlisted in the Air Force cadet business. And then a period of time, a few months from the enlistment to the time that they said, come, you're going to, well, we went first to Atlantic City, as I remember it. Well, it started at Devon's, I believe, and then they took us down to Atlantic City for a month or something.
Mm-hmm. And now when you were discharged, that was a little iffy, but it was around 45. And then you did some time in the reserves, or they wanted you to.
Well,
we'll talk about that a little more. So you mentioned the reason you chose that branch was more or less from your father's influence and a decision to do that.
There's no question whatsoever that when your father told you to jump, you jumped. And so he led me to the Air Force, and it wasn't in the sense that he ordered you, but he very carefully laid the groundwork so that you did what he wanted to do. That's as simple as that.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit today's world, where I think to a great degree the kids would make that decision, but your parents made that kind of a decision back in the 40s.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned you went to Devon's and then Atlantic City for what they called your boot camp at that time?
Yep. I think we were there in Atlantic City for a month, and we were living in a hotel that had been taken over by the military. And every day we spent the day walking up and down, marching up and down the boardwalk. That's all I can remember.
Do you remember, was it hard for you to adjust to this type of life, or?
Yes and no, I suppose. Yeah, it was different than I was used to, but and the idea of marching all day on the boardwalk felt ridiculous as I remember it, but yet you knew you had to do it. That's what they were telling you to do, so you did it.
Do you remember, did you mention how long the boot camp was there?
I think I was there a month.
Okay. And then where did you go?
They then shifted me up to the University of Buffalo, New York. That was winter time as I remember it, because I can remember snow on the ground up there, and I'd say we were there for 3 months, and mostly in 99% of the time in classroom work. There wasn't any marching or military atmosphere or anything. We were in uniform, but in class doing studying.
And then from Buffalo, where did they send you?
Down to Columbus in the south. Columbus, I can't come up with the
Mississippi?
state.
Was it Mississippi?
Columbus, Mississippi. Yeah, it could be. Yep.
And you know, what did that entail?
That was the start of the flying.
Okay.
And I think that was that again. I think was 3 months. I'm not sure. A long time ago, and my memory is not perfect, but I think we were 3 months down there, progressively training and flying.
Now you mentioned you did start out in a single engine aircraft and moved up.
My recollection was single engine, twin open cockpit. The instructor would be in one cockpit and you'd be in the other, and you'd fly 2 or 3 or 4 hours just around the field, maneuvering the plane, learning how to fly it. And when you made a mistake, the instructor hollered from cockpit to cockpit at you. I don't think we had a radio between us. I don't remember it.
Yeah. And now and then you moved up to probably twin engines, and
There was a period on that field where we moved to twin engine, yes. And I think it was on that field. I don't think they moved us to another field.
And do you remember any of the like? Did you have to do night flying and that type of?
I remember formation flying. I remember night flying, and particularly in the twin engine plane. I don't think we did that in the single engine plane, but we had all types of flying in the twin engine. And
now I think you were there a little longer than 3 months, because we had that you graduated from there in March of '44, and you graduated as a second lieutenant. Is that correct? Now, my understanding is they actually had to discharge you, didn't they, as an enlisted person, and then.
in going through the papers that I had, and they were not in good shape, I was fairly sure that we got discharged as a cadet and then given a commission, a second lieutenant commission.
Now, do you remember where you went to after you became a second lieutenant?
Went home for a week, as I remember it. I'm quite positive that they flew me up to Grenier Field, and I went home for a week. And then they took me down to Devon's. Is it Devon?
No, you went to Westover from there.
That's right, too. Okay, my father drove me down to Westover and dropped me at the gate. Yep. Okay, that was the start of the 4-engine flying then.
You mentioned too, they wouldn't allow your dad on the base, so you had to walk.
Well,
Now, you had a problem there for a while, though, didn't you? You mentioned getting a crew and.
my recollection is that we all arrived. I don't remember signing in any place, but we all arrived in a barracks. They told us at the gate, go over there and find that way, and such a barracks, and you're in the barracks there. And we all, most of us knew each other because we had met in flying school different times. Even the cadets that flunked out of flying school, most of them became, went to bombardier school or navigator school or different gunnery school, so that many of the people that were at Westover being formed into a 10 personnel plane bomber crew, you knew before you got there. You'd met they were either in flying school all the way with you, or they had flunked out of flying school and gone through some other school and were now on their way overseas. So we all seemed to know each other, and it was quite a reunion there when we get into the barracks. And the next day, first thing we saw was a posting on the bulletin board of all the crews. And I remember that day awfully well because I went over the listings 101 times, I think, and I wasn't on them. And they all my friends went down to the airport, down to the hangar at the field, and got put on planes and formed and started to fly. And I still was not on any crew. The crowd was there for about a month, and I was there for about a month the same, but not on any crew, but I knew everybody, and if the crew was just flying hours, they didn't have an instructor on the plane, I was allowed to fly with them. If they had an instructor on their plane, I was not allowed to fly with them because I guess I was considered a distraction. So for the month I did flying and learned how to handle the planes and everything, but I had no standard. I'd often walk around Westover looking for how to get on the crew. I knew something had gone wrong, and all I could find on the base was the base headquarters, and they kept telling me, go back where your barracks is, and one of those buildings right around there will have a sign on it that they're the headquarters for your operation, and they'll straighten it out. That did not happen for the month. But then all of a sudden one day, the start of the next month, there's a new sign on a building, headquarters, and so I went in, and it was quite a lesson. I was a lieutenant, and I walked in the door, and there was a short sergeant, master sergeant, I guess, with stripes on his arm, on his uniform arm, from I think the wrist to the elbow, indicating he was a long-term servant in the Air Force. And I explained to him what was going on, and he went off like a skyrocket, blasting me for not coming into the office and straightening it out the first day instead of a month after the fact. And I knew that he should not be talking to an officer that way, but I also knew that I was a new officer and didn't know the ropes, and I wasn't about to get in an argument with him. And the thing that saved me was that in the back of the office there was an office door, and it opened, and the major stepped out and listened for a little bit and came mooching over and spoke to the sergeant, asked him to quiet down and tell me what's going on. And he listened, and he said, well, what have we got on Sheridan's records? Let me see those. And the sergeant admitted that he couldn't find them. They're not in the file. He doesn't know what this is all about. So the major told me to go back to my barracks and stay there, and told the sergeant to track down his records. And I think the next day, the major I don't remember the dates, but the major came in the afternoon, came to the barracks, and he said, we have a plane that headed for England, that the co-pilot has had an appendix attack, he's in the hospital. We're going to put you on that plane and you go on your way to England.
Mm-hmm. Now, before you got to England, you said while you were there, you met a girl out on the beach, or so to speak, or out.
Well, while I was at Westover, I wasn't doing too much of anything, particularly in the evenings, and I'd drift around Holyoke a little bit, and maybe visit a bar or something. But one Sunday morning, there was a couple of us that I knew and myself, and we went into what was then the Roger Smith Hotel and went into the bar and had a drink Sunday morning, and there was a half a dozen girls there. They had been to a communion breakfast and they were having a drink or something, and we kind of made contact and talked, and one young lady I got acquainted with and had a telephone number and an address for. She lived in South Hadley, just across the river from Holyoke. So I made a date with her for the next night, and we went to supper together, and that progressed gradually until I went overseas, and we wrote to each other while I was overseas, and when we come back, we reestablished our friendship. And I've forgotten now, but it wasn't too much longer before we got married.
Mm-hmm. So you are heading overseas now. You got a plane, and what were these planes, Phil?
These were, I remember them as B-24s, but
okay.
I'm not positive. We did a little swapping back and forth through the war, B-24, B-17, but they were always four-engine planes. Mm-hmm. And I ended up in a reconnaissance outfit.
Could you tell us how you got over there, though, Phil? I mean,
that's a four-engine plane went over there, mm-hmm. and I had flown not actually logging flying time, but I'd be in the planes with the guys, and they'd be showing me what to do and even letting me fly a little bit, so that I was very familiar with the mm-hmm. planes. And when I joined the crew on its way overseas, and I don't think we were together for an hour before we were off the ground and on our way overseas. I wasn't an amateur.
You mentioned stopping at Nova Scotia because of the weather over in England.
Well, that was a routine stop. Yeah,
uh-huh.
Those planes did not have the capacity to fly from, say, the U.S. to England, so okay. They went up in Nova Scotia. As I remember, there was Nova Scotia Gander Field. I'm almost positive was the name of it. But normally you'd just gassed up there and then gone the rest of the way over to England, but they had piled up an awful gang of planes there because England was all closed in with a storm for a number of days. And I guess in normal circumstances, a crew that was stopped at Gander, if they stayed overnight, they put them up in a hotel, in a barracks there. Most of them gassed up and kept going on to England. But when we got there was about 3 days worth of planes landed on the ground there and weren't able to go to England, so that the barracks were all filled, and a lot of the crews were sleeping in the airplane, and that's where we ended up sleeping in the airplane. The toilet facilities were under the airplane on the ground, and luckily it was all men.
So you finally did get off to England.
I think we were there a couple of days, and then we left for England. Yep.
You mentioned too getting over there was a problem.
Yeah, there were so many planes over there that they were diverting them to North Ireland, and that's where we ended up. at the time, and I think we were there for a day or two before they took us down to a field in England that was directly under the control of the 8th Air Force.
Mm-hmm. So once you got to England, what was your assignment?
We got assigned to the reconnaissance organization, 8th Air Force, but we weren't doing bomber, we were doing reconnaissance, mostly weather reconnaissance out over the Atlantic, so that they'd know what the next day's weather would be in England and in Germany, and bombing crews could be directed and so forth. Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned that's where you actually became the pilot because you're...
I was just going to comment on that. That was the pilot of the plane that they put me on as a replacement co-pilot. The pilot was a military infantry man that I remember him as a captain. And when we got to the permanent field, the reconnaissance field that we had been assigned to, he was welcomed tremendously and taken off the plane, and I guess he was promoted to captain. I guess he was a first lieutenant, and he was promoted to captain and made the base executive officer. Mm-hmm. And I got promoted to pilot and from co-pilot, and then almost throughout the war, every time I flew, I had a different co-pilot. They'd shop around on the field and find somebody that they could either order to fly with me or that wanted to make the trip, wanted the extra mission. So there was a lot of different co-pilots that flew with me through the term of the war.
Do you remember the first pilot name that became captain?
Delorme, George Delorme, is that?
No, that was, he was your navigator. Was that Bishop?
Oh, Howard Bishop, that's who it was. Yep,
yeah.
Yep, Howard Bishop. He was the infantry guy that was first lieutenant and got promoted to captain almost as soon as we landed on the permanent field. Mm-hmm. They were happy to see him.
Now you ended up making first lieutenant over there.
Yep.
So you went on these weather reconnaissance missions, and you said they altered the aircraft to fit these. They put in extra fuel tanks or something?
They stripped the Bombay and put in the B-24s, as I remembered, it was 4 gasoline tanks. And in the B-17s, I think they only had space for 2 tanks. Mm-hmm. And that's why we really didn't have B-17s. They used them over the continent a little bit, but most of the weather reconnaissance, in fact, all of the weather reconnaissance out over the Atlantic were B-24s, as I remember it. Mm-hmm. They had you were in the air for 13, 14 hours flying out into the Atlantic, taking weather readings every so often. We had instead of a bombardier, we had a meteorologist on the plane who would be operating the measuring equipment for the weather. And then when we get out to the end of the run, we drop down near sea level and do a climb all the way up in place to like 30,000 feet or something. That was a real gasoline consumer. And then they would direct us to go to some field based on information they had in England regarding the weather. Most times the wind was coming from the north or the northwest, and they'd direct us down to the Azores. But if we had a south wind, in order to get you on the ground safely, they'd make you fly up to Iceland as a rule. Mm-hmm. I think once or twice airplanes were directed into Greenfield, but you rarely had a wind that would take you in there. Mm-hmm. But you're on a ragged edge for gasoline and always glad to get on the ground.
Now you did mention one mission you were on, you came close to running out of fuel.
I think as we approached the Azores airport, one engine quit and I was scared stiff that we were going to lose 2 or 3 more engines before we got on the ground, but we kept going and banged down on the ground about the time the second engine quit. It was a lucky landing over the end of the runway.
Now you did mention that that's basically the danger that you had was running out of fuel on those missions. You didn't have to
Always
worry
a concern, yeah.
Yeah, you didn't have to
But
worry.
that only happened to me once. I know it happened other times, once or twice, not very common, but it was touch and go always.
Mm-hmm. Now you did mention that you did go on some bombing missions, that they'd have an all-out.
I wanted to try them and learn a little something about them, and it looked like, you know, that was the prime purpose of being a pilot. So a couple of times I was able to make an arrangement through my headquarters and with the air headquarters in some other field, and the fields were, you know, only a few miles apart. It was a cinch to get from one to the other, and I made a couple of flights over the continent on bombing missions. That convinced me that I was in a great position in the weather reconnaissance as compared to getting shot at over Europe, so that when I finished my first tour of duty with the reconnaissance, which was 30 missions, I volunteered to stay there for a second tour of duty, and at that time a tour of duty had been extended to 35 missions. I was still perfectly comfortable with that and stayed for the second tour.
Now on the bombing missions, you mentioned that there were so many airplanes. You really didn't have a target per se that you were dropping on. You mentioned dropping. You'd follow the lead plane and just drop your bombs a few seconds behind him or whatever.
Well, I suspect that was true of most of the planes in the mission. My only complaint, if once in a while we'd have a bomber that would come, a new bomber that would come into the reconnaissance field, or the reconnaissance field hadn't been converted to the gasoline tanks in the bomb bay, and the 8th Air Force would have a special mission that they wanted every plane they could get in on, particularly as an example, the Berlin missions. Berlin was heavily defended and yet heavily bombed. And the formation would fly over Berlin, and of course the lead plane would be the controlling plane. It'd be, I suppose, a major or something in there, a higher officer that would make the decision on when to drop the bombs and everything. And everybody then knew that, depending on what they had been instructed to do, that they dropped the bombs simultaneously, or sometimes 10 seconds or 20 seconds later. Depends on what they were how they were trying to hit the target. My complaint on the bombing missions, as far as I was concerned, was particularly if it was a plane out of our reconnaissance group. They tucked us on the back end of the formation, and it was the group that was most heavily assaulted by the German fighter planes, so that it made me very uncomfortable to be there as compared to up in the closed part of the formation.
You were more vulnerable on the.
Pardon me?
You were more vulnerable on that,
Yes.
that tail.
But of course I was volunteering for it, and I only volunteered a couple of times, and I said, baloney on this, these are much more dangerous missions than the weather reconnaissance missions. And I didn't know of any reason why I should be doing it, and stopped doing it. Used my head. That's why I stayed for the second tour of duty too. That reconnaissance it had some risks, but it was a heck of a fewer risk than the bombing missions.
Right. Now you mentioned you did fly just on I guess a training flight, an English plane that was it was a wooden,
We were reconnaissance, and while most of our flights were weather reconnaissance, we had planes that were equipped with cameras. If there was something that the 8th Air Force wanted in camera reconnaissance over the continent, sometimes we were directed to go with those planes. Now, there were other reconnaissance planes that were doing the same thing. For why the 8th Air Force would pick out our airplane to go, I don't know that method, but I did fly some reconnaissance over the continent, photo reconnaissance, and if it was far enough, we'd fly high reconnaissance, and I suppose the cameras were able to overcome the distance, and you'd pretty much alone, the plane was pretty much alone flying those, and you'd get the pictures and get back out. Now, they also had some very fast twin-engine English planes that were made of wood, plywood covering and wood structure, and they were very fast. They had American engines in them, the Allison water-cooled engine, as I remember it, they had in them. And once in a while we'd fly those over low level to get some pictures for something. You wouldn't know what the 8th Air Force was going to do with them, but they'd say, we want pictures of such and such a place. And so with those planes, and I think the name of the plane was referred to as a Scorpion, but I'm not sure. The name doesn't ring right with me. But it was a fast wooden plane, and we'd go in maybe a few hundred feet high and take the pictures. But you'd be going in at 400 or 500 miles an hour, as I remember it, and taking one quick run over it and get the devil out, because there was just too much risk of getting shot down by either ground fire or fighters.
right. So again, you said you, after your first 30 missions, you volunteered for another series.
My first one was 20, no, yes, that's right. The initial requirement over there for the flyers was 25 missions. That was before I ever arrived there. That was the start of the war. And by the time I got there, it was 30 missions was your tour of duty. And when I finished that, I volunteered for another tour of duty at 35 missions. That was a standard at the time. Because I felt that it was just a good service and reasonably safe service as compared to either coming back to the States and then getting reassigned to the 8th Air Force after a month's leave of absence, or the other one was that many of the flyers were being sent to the Pacific to fly the B-29s, and from what little correspondence I had with friends, the B-29 flights were more dangerous than anything that we were facing in Europe. So I was very happy to just stay in my reconnaissance, and there were risks with the weather reconnaissance, but I think there were fewer risks than faced by the regular bombers.
So you finished up over there until the war ended? You were over there?
Pardon me?
You were over there until the war ended?
Yes, my second tour of duty ran out a week or two before the war ended, and they locked everybody in to continue to fly missions until the war ended. And I got another half a dozen missions or something before the war ended. At that point, though, my navigator, George DeLorme, and myself both said, we've had enough of flying. Let's go back by boat. And I told the brass and headquarters what we wanted, and they said, the boats are taking back the infantry, and you guys are going to fly back. And we said no, and it was discussed, and I'm not sure why they didn't just order us to follow orders and get on that plane, but they didn't. They just shifted us from one base to another. As the 8th Air Force closed up Base X, they'd move us to Base Y, and from Y to Z. And was an easy life for us, but finally we realized that we're going to be here as Englishmen if we don't finally go home on a plane. And so we said, okay, put us on a plane. And I always remember George DeLong got on a plane the next day after we agreed to go, or something like that. And I didn't get on a plane until a day later. So he went over, he left, and I left a day later. And when I get to Manchester, New Hampshire, to home, I had his telephone number down in Washington. I think it was Washington, D.C., or just outside. And I had his telephone number, so I gave him a call when I got out. And he said, "Oh, Phil," and he gave me a line of blasting and swearing, and we crashed in Greenland on a snowbank, and everybody got out all right, but gee, what an experience. I'm never going to fly again. Whether he ever flew again or not, I don't know.
Now, you mentioned you got home and went right to Grenier. You landed at Grenier Field.
And I knew Grenier Field, and so I wasted no time in taking my duffel bag, walking up to the gate of the airport, air base, and I knew that the bus picked up the soldiers there that wanted to go to Manchester, and so the bus took them into Manchester. So I waited there for a few minutes, or maybe it was 10 or 15 minutes, and the bus arrived, and I climbed on. There was, and I went home, and my mother, when I walked in, and I'm walking in the yard, and I hear her in there shouting, "Phil's home, Phil's home." And so they all met me on the porch as I tried to walk in the house. Yeah. But there was a row over the fact that I left without going to headquarters or getting permission or anything. And I think they were all about ready to court-martial me or something. And again, my sister, working with the general, I think saved me, and they made peace all around.
And after that time, the reserves tried to get you in, didn't they?
Yep. They insisted that I was in the Air Force as a reservist, and I was to report for duty. You know, not continuous duty, but to fly once in a while. And yeah, if they started another war, suddenly you'd find yourself as one of the lead Air Force people on it. And I wanted no part of flying anyway, so it was a continuous row for a number of months. I've forgotten just what it was all, how it was all settled, but finally it was all dropped, and I went to school. I went back into college. That was the end of the Air Force in any way, shape, or manner.
So,
and I'd never seen discharge papers I got a discharge paper when as a cadet. I finished up there, and I got appointed as a second lieutenant and so forth. But then when the end came, and the reservists finally gave up on me, I never saw any discharge papers. I don't know what the standing is.
So after you did get home and get settled, did you go right back to work, or did you go to work?
No, I settled down, and it was, let's see, it was summer, all right. I settled down and bought a dog, a German Shepherd as I remember it, and brought it home, and my mother was shocked. And when it got to September, I guess it was October, my father finally said, "You got to go back to college and get going." And he called up down to the college and talked to the brother Leo that was the boss down there, Manhattan College. And brother Leo told my father, as I understand it, my freshman grades were very good, and I'd only missed a couple of weeks of the sophomore. Send him down, we'd put him into class, and he'll make the grade. And So I think the next day my father took me down to Manhattan College and dropped me off. You're going to college. And I may have been grown up as a result of the war service, but it was still a case of where your parents said, jump, you jump. So I went to college. And
Now you mentioned you graduated in '49.
I think that was it, yeah. Yep.
And in the summers, you would work for, was it Time Bond that you would work summers?
Well, I think the first summer I worked for my father in Lyons Iron Works. The second summer I married Marilyn Waring, and she became Mrs. Sheridan. And I moved down there to South Hadley. Her parents had an apartment in the attic of their house. They had an apartment, and they put us up there, and Marilyn was working in the Worthington Corporation in Holyoke, and I went looking for a job and found one with Tighe & Bond. And it was a water supply and sewage treatment engineer, and very good organization to work for, and Phil Bond was particularly a gentleman, a good boss. So I worked there till I graduated, and then for trying to fit it together, I think I had graduated, and Marilyn and I took 2 weeks as a delayed honeymoon. We've been married for about 2 years, but we didn't have either the money or the time to go on a honeymoon. So, but when we finished college, we managed to work it in. Before we did, I went into Tighe & Bond, and Phil Bond said yes, he'd be very happy to take me on. No, that's wrong. He was all apologies that he couldn't take me on, that there's just a slack in the business and I'd have to go find something else. So I went shopping and ended up with one of the Holyoke contractors as their engineer, as their assistant engineer, Daniel O'Connell company.
And they were doing the flood work around Northampton at that time, weren't they?
Well, no, they were doing different jobs, road jobs, but there was a lot of flood control, dike construction going on. And they hired me and assigned me to West Springfield, to a flood control project down there.
Okay.
Setting grades on the dike so they properly got constructed. And then after a few months down there, out of a clear sky, Phil Bond arrived down on the job, found me, offered me a job. He'd like to take me on, and I wanted to work for him. And so he agreed, okay. And I said, well, I got to give O'Connell a couple of weeks' notice so they can make some transition. And Phil asked me what kind of money I wanted, and I showed him my check I'd just been paid that day by O'Connell. And he took a look at the check and said, oh my God, there's no way I could pay you that kind of money. You better stay with Dan O'Connell. Well, I said, no, I want to work in the engineering office. And well, Phil Bond made an offer, and I took it. I've forgotten what the pays were, but it was substantially less than what I was getting from O'Connell. And I gave O'Connell a 2 weeks' notice and arrived at the Tighe & Bond office to find that Phil Bond had died suddenly during that 2 weeks, and George McDonald was running it. He said, I know that Phil Bond agreed that we could take you on, and I agree, and so come to work. In fact, I guess I was arriving there on a Monday morning when this took place. That's what it was. And so I went to work, and that was the rest of my life I worked there.
Now,
Not the rest of my life, I'm still alive, but the rest of my working life, I enjoyed it, went up through the chain of command and finally was the boss.
now tell us how you got back to flying again.
Oh, as I came up through the chain of command in Tigard Bond, George McDonald was still there, and Ed Bayon was another one that was on the part owner and chain of command. He had been the superintendent of public works in Holyoke, and a new mayor was elected. I'm not just sure of when it was prior to this time that we're talking about, but at any rate, as a result of conflict between the mayor and Ed Bayon acting as superintendent of public works, Ed Bayon quit as superintendent and came looking for a job, and George McDonald took him on as a partner. By then, I was also a partner, so that the three partners were working together, and it was a very happy, comfortable relationship. But Ed Bayon was trying to expand the firm, and he went looking for work in different places, and he made a contact with an engineering firm by the name of Sipican Consultants down in Cambridge, I believe. And they were just taking on a job in Saudi Arabia, and but very happy to take on a water supply and sewage engineer as an assistant. And so we became part involved in that project. I knew about it, and I thought that we'd be assigning one of the older engineers in the office to supervise the project. That's the way we generally worked. But one day the three partners, myself, Bayon, and McDonald, sat down, and the two of them, in hindsight, I think had obviously been talking, and the consensus was, as a two, that Phil Sheridan should become the engineer on it and should head for Saudi Arabia. And I said, I haven't flown since World War II, and I'm not planning on flying, and you guys all know it. You got to change it, Phil. And so after some discussion, I finally said, okay. I went home and told my wife about it, and I think she nearly fainted. But it wasn't too much longer, another couple of weeks, and I was on an airplane. Initially we headed for Saudi Arabia and had a general meeting of the architectural and engineering organization was going to lay out the base and plan it and get it ready for construction. But that was just a one single trip to Saudi Arabia, and it was determined then that Saudi Arabia did not have any suitable office facilities or hotel facilities to handle an organization like we had to have to do the planning. So the decision was made to do the planning in Rome, and the reason for the selection of Rome was that the architect had a Rome office. Now the architect was really a U.S. firm, but they had a Rome office, so that everybody centered around Rome, and we opened up an office in Rome, was 2-man or 3-man office, secretary, etc. And I'd fly once a month over for the general meeting to help guide the thing. And we had junior engineers or senior engineers in Rome, living there, working on the job. But there'd be a monthly meeting with the Saudi government officials would come up, and the engineers, and might be 20 people or something would get together there, and it'd be a 2 or 3 or 4 day series of meetings while different things were explained or discussed and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So that's how you got back into flying again.
I got back into flying, and I forgot now. Marilyn and I, my wife and I, must have been married in 47, 52, 62, 72. Yeah, and this was 72 that we were doing the Saudi work, and then I started flying. So one day I came home to her and looked at her and says, you know, I'm flying, and we didn't even have much of a honeymoon when we got married, and now our 25th anniversary, we're going to fly down to enjoy it. She nearly fell off the chair. But we did go down and enjoy it for a 25th anniversary.
So, as you mentioned, you finished up with Ty and Bond as a career,
Yep.
becoming a partner, and
I was the single. The other two partners had died off, and I was a single partner. And yes, I had a group underneath me that was all capable of being partners, but I did not take them up the last step. And I ran that company for a few years, kind of alone, you might say, perfectly happy with it.
mm-hmm.
And then, yes, we started to move them up into partnership level, and I finally retired in 12 or 13 years ago. Let's see, this is 07, 90,
95 you had mentioned.
95, someplace back there.
Mm-hmm.
Still go in once in a while and visit, and I have a lot of friends there, et cetera, but I'm not an active member anymore.
Mm-hmm. Now you did, obviously, you mentioned your wife several times, so you did get married, and
While I was in school, the summer, we got married.
mm-hmm. And how many children did you have, Phil?
Well, nobody ever told us where they came from, as far as I know, so we ended up having 11. And I don't know, we would have had probably 20 or 30 if it had kept going, but when she had her 11th, something went wrong with the birth. The baby died at birth, and she damn close to died at birth. It was a miracle that she survived the blood loss, but she did. But that was the end of the children. She lost her working parts. Mm-hmm. We lost two other children, one to meningitis and one in a drowning accident. Mm-hmm. They were both boys. So we ended up bringing up 6 girls and 2 boys. Mm-hmm. Happy family.
Good. And you mentioned that your wife and yourself still travel to Aruba every now and again and enjoy the change.
When I was active in Ty and Bond, if we saw each other once a day, we considered it quite an occurrence. But once we retired, we started to go to the Caribbean. And now we go generally 3 times a year. We go at Thanksgiving for a couple of weeks, and we go in February for a couple of weeks, and we go in May for 3 weeks. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever join any veterans organizations, Phil?
I joined the Legion, but I not. All I do is read their magazine. And as I remember it, I don't even pay dues. I'm so old that they took me in as a non-dues paying member or something. Yeah. But I do get their magazine, and they do recognize me as a member. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever keep in touch with any of your old buddies or?
Wartime buddies, no. George DeLong and I didn't fly, and he was down in Washington or something down near there. Mm-hmm. So that he was the one I was most likely to join with once in a while, but he didn't fly and I didn't fly. So, and then when I finally started flying, I had no idea of where he is or anything. So it's.
Now, do you feel the service had a negative or positive effect on your life, or any effect?
Any effect, I guess. I don't see any effect. Mm-hmm. I suppose it had a positive effect. It made me grow up, for sure. It don't remember any negative effect.
Phil, I'd like to refer to this picture for a minute that we have. What is the significance of that picture?
Well, I'm surprised at it to some extent. When you told me that you wanted this interview or et cetera, I did a lot of searching around and found some records and found that picture among other things, and I don't remember them giving you the air medal the way that's occurring in that picture, so that my intuition says that for some reason or other the major wanted to do something, and so that instead of just saying, hey, you got another air medal, he set up that medal pinning operation, and I don't know whether it was me alone or there was another 25 officers that were getting the air medal that time. I just don't know all of the significance. I suspect that the major wanted to get some kind of publicity, and whether it was publicity for the English newspapers or whether it was publicity for himself or for myself, I have no idea.
Now, how many missions did you have to do to get that air medal?
My recollection is every 5 missions you got the air medal, and every 25 missions you got the flying cross. If you got wounded, of course, you got a medal, and there was some other medals handed out, silver stars or something, but those were the only 2 medals that I got.
Well, Phil, I really want to thank you for taking the time to come and tell us your story, and we want to thank you for the service and the sacrifices you made for your country. Thank you very much.
I appreciate getting called and so forth, and it's made me dig into the records a little bit. I couldn't even find that picture, and it wasn't in anything. We have 101 pictures that you collect through the years, but Marilyn looked at me as though couldn't believe the picture, and I think that I felt the same way. But I appreciate coming up here and doing this, and
Well, again,
we'll
we
see
thank
how
you
it
for
works
doing
out.
Thank you, Phil.
Quite a life.